to our webinar on building the capacity to invest in rural prosperity through cross-sector collaboration. My name is Jane Kolodinsky, and I'm the CFAIR board member and professor at the University of Vermont. It's my pleasure to be moderating this session today. Next slide. It's the Council on Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics, CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. Next slide. Today's webinar is a result of a collaborative effort between the Regional Rural Development Centers, those are the RRDCs, and CFAIR. To effectively leverage their assets for the long-term shared prosperity, rural communities need robust local capacity that has strong connections at the regional, state, and federal levels. Some rural communities have this strong connected local capacities, while others do not. Unfortunately, the historically challenged rural communities that most need these critical capacities and connections to alter their future trajectories are the least likely to have them. Given these realities, how can the public, philanthropic, financial, nonprofit, and academic sectors work together to support efforts by these communities to build and maintain the capacities necessary to create shared economic prosperity in the future? This webinar will discuss effective, collaborative rural capacity building strategies and policy proposals that can make these practices easier and more widespread. Next slide. But before handing the mic over to John Green, who will be helping moderate the webinar, I wanted to explain how to ask questions during the webinar to make sure that you in the audience know how to engage. During the webinar, you can put questions to one or all of the speakers by typing it into the box in the control display accessed by clicking on the question drop-down as shown on this slide, and then send it to the organizer. Next slide. To kick off the webinar, I'll be handing this over to John Green for context for today's webinar and to moderate the panel. John J. Green, PhD, is the director of the Southern Regional Development Center, SRDC, an organization focused on building capacity among 30 land-grant universities. Dr. Green also serves as professor in the Mississippi State University, MSU, Department of Agricultural Economics and affiliated faculty in the Department of Sociology. He is the current president of the Rural Sociological Society. Over to you, John.
All right, thank you, Jane. Before we get started, as Jane mentioned, I'll be providing some background on today's topic. As discussed during previous sessions in this webinar series, the Regional Rural Development Centers conducted a rapid response survey in the fall of 2021 and a series of regional and national listening sessions in the spring of 2022. With the RRDC celebrating a 50-year history of the Rural Development Act, this contemporary work was intended to help inform future investment priority areas for collaborative partners. This connects with and complements efforts by CFAIR and other partners, such as the Federal Reserve Bank, and its initiatives concerning investments in rural prosperity. From the survey and listening sessions, the top priorities were infrastructure, economic development, workforce development, and health. Although deemed as important, our stakeholders, including those from but not limited to research and extension in the land-grant university system, a broad range of nonprofit organizations, local government and businesses, also felt that their organizations had limited capacity in these areas. So to build on the themes already mentioned, we're asking how to better connect different people and organizations in working within, between, and across sectors to build capacity for local action that will result in regional and national benefits. What can we learn from each other about capacity building, and what lessons can be translated to broader programmatic and policy insights by bringing together nonprofits, philanthropic organizations, private and public sectors? Next slide. CFAIR and the RRDCs have assembled a panel of 3 experts to discuss their work, starting with Tony Pippa, a senior fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. He launched and leads the Reimagining Federal Rural Policy Initiative, which seeks to modernize and transform U.S. federal policy to enable equitable rural prosperity. Next slide. We'll also hear from Holly Frindell, who's Chief Program Officer and oversees the National Association for Latino Community Asset Builders, Equitable Neighborhood Development, Financial Capability, and Small Business Program areas. She brings over 14 years of experience in municipal and nonprofit program management, addressing issues such as financial empowerment, economic development, and homelessness. Next slide. And then we'll hear from Ivy L. Allen. She's president of the Foundation for the Mid-South, a regional foundation serving Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. The foundation funds programs and initiatives that focus on community development, education, health and wellness, and wealth building. So we'll start off our remarks from Tony Pippa. Next slide. Over to you, Tony.
Thanks, John, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm calling in from rural Mississippi, and really honored to be in this conversation with Holly and Ivy, 2 really strong regional leaders that have a great deal of experience in this work. I thought I'd start off just by kind of reviewing, especially off of some of the other conversations that we have about what we know needs to be in place, or what can enable cross-sector collaboration for capacity at the local level. And certainly that starts with ensuring that our strategies are place-based, and that the investment that's being made in civic infrastructure and physical infrastructure is focused at the level of place, and places that are particularly being buffeted by economic and other shocks. But those are often need to be accompanied by people-based strategies, because collaboration across sectors, even within sectors, actually requires time, energy, a dedicated focus, and you need human capital to make that work. And in plain English, increasing capacity, the ability and having the ability to collaborate can simply mean more staffing. That can mean more money available for hiring. You know, one of the most important lessons that came out of the analyses of the promise zones, the federal program that happened in the Obama administration, was the power of providing funds and actually just hiring a coordinator at the local level to help the different partners come together across sectors. And to enable that work over time, and to make sure that it continued to sustain itself over time. And you've seen the impact of expanding human capital by embedding people actually directly in communities, people who come from the outside with specific expertise or commitment or energy. The American Connection Corps, for example, in Minnesota, provided fellows that Minnesota placed within communities to work to build broadband plans and coalitions to great success. And you have initiatives that happen through things like AmeriCorps to enable to bring people in and increase that human capacity. And then I think a third pillar here is the technical assistance and expertise that needs to accompany partners as they're working in place to collaborate. And that often comes from intermediaries and backbone organizations, outside groups that are regionally focused sometimes, sometimes nationally focused, but they understand the local context, history, and politics. They have expertise in organizational development activities like facilitation, coaching, professional development, but they can also access or even provide specific technical expertise like grant writing, engineering and legal services, financial services, and also have experience in strengthening peer networks. So with those as kind of three pillars to be thinking about, what I thought I'd do is just talk a little bit about where things are within the federal government right now related to investments in capacity and collaboration at the local level. There is a great deal of opportunity through recent legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure law, even some money from the American Rescue Plan Act, and then there'll be also additional resources through the Inflation Reduction Act, and even resources potentially made available through the CHIPS and Science Act that rural communities will be able to avail themselves of. But these are processes which are sometimes difficult to navigate. It can be challenging for local communities to even identify which of the mechanisms or programs make most sense for them, and then to build the networks at the local level that can successfully apply, accept, and then manage those particular programs over time. I think there is increasing recognition within the federal government of recognizing the dynamics to enable capacity at the local level if communities are going to successfully access and employ and deploy the resources that the federal government has available. And you've seen new efforts start to come to the fore through that recognition. The Rural Partners Network, which is a whole of government effort headed by USDA Rural Development, which is placing federal staff on the ground in highly vulnerable, low capacity communities, has a first cohort in 5 different states. And the staff will actually work with networks of organizations in those local communities to help them navigate the federal resources available. But provide facilitation services and others to kind of build strong collaboration and networks on the ground. And USDA Rural Development also has capacity building funding, although at a fairly low level through things like its Rural Community Development Initiative. I mentioned the CHIPS and Science Act. One of the new programs authorized through the CHIPS and Science Act was the Recompete Pilot Program, which will actually make available pre-development funding through planning grants that would be available for local networks to collaborate and be able to plan together, specifically focused on areas of significant economic distress. And the Economic Recovery Corps from the Economic Development Administration is seeking to launch a fellows program that would place 50 fellows in underserved communities to work on economic development in underserved communities across the U.S. And then I think the last thing I would say is you're seeing, and you will see more of this, you will see particular federal agencies make technical assistance funding available. Most of the funding is going to be focused on expertise rather than collaboration in and of itself. It will provide assistance on specific technical or legal or financial and grant writing. For example, the EPA has announced up to $18 million to build the pipeline of technical assistance focused on rural, small, and tribal communities, and particularly focused on meeting issues of equity there. But I think it will also continue to leave gaps for philanthropy and for regional intermediaries to fill the holes around things like staffing and local management of networks and peer learning amongst networks. And I hope we get to talk more about this as the conversation rolls out here today. I'll just leave it there, John.
All right, thank you so much, Tony, for the insights that you shared, and thanks for joining us from the Mississippi Delta. We'll go ahead and move forward with Ivy Allen. Ivy, are you able to join us?
I am. I can't come on camera. We're having problems, but I am on.
Yeah, thank you. So please go ahead, and then after you're finished, we'll see if Holly's able to join.
Sure. And I'm Ivy Allen. I'm with the Foundation for the Mid-South. We are a regional foundation here covering, we're in Jackson, Mississippi, but we cover Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. So on that screen, you'll see the 3 states that are our primary focus area. Next slide. So our mission statement is the Foundation for the Mid-South invests in people and strategies that build philanthropy and promote racial, social, and economic equity throughout our 3 states of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Next slide. We have what we call priority areas, and we have 4 areas, and to be honest, oftentimes they may interrelate. But we focus on education, and that is about ensuring students reach academic success through high quality education, and that can go from K to 12 up to higher ed. In our health and wellness work, we are obviously about improving the physical and mental health. And in our wealth building is really about assisting families to build financial security. And it actually, all of these quite often overlap and work together. And our final priority area is community development, and that is about engaging residents to develop solutions that allow their communities to grow and prosper. And as I said, many of those, for the most part, are interrelated, and at times they're individuals, but then other times, depending on the type of work we're doing, we are addressing more than one of those priorities at one time. Next slide. And so I'll talk a little bit about capacity build requirements that will make sure that, particularly in the rural communities that we serve, how we're able to assist them. And we work with them to be clear about their goals, objectives, and intended outcomes. And we challenge them to come up with a vision, those objectives, strategies, and most important to us is metrics and measures. And that's important because we, interact with groups and organizations at various capacities. And for us, we always want them to try to set some achievable goals and objectives. We don't want them to oversell what they can deliver, particularly in these various sizes communities. So we work hard at getting them to be specific, but we work with them not to oversell what their abilities will be. And then we try to, again, work with them on what their expected accomplishments are. And that's really making sure that they are reasonable, realistic, and achievable. And when you're working in some of these rural communities, it's very difficult sometimes with transportation and other things. So we don't want folks to sit and tell us they can do more than they can do, because it's maybe a number of things that may be inhibiting them from being able to be as successful. Transportation sometimes can be one of the biggest ones in that process. Next slide. For us with the capacity building, we really try to make sure that they have clearly stated goals, objectives, and intended outcomes, as I noted. And we ask them things like, how do you know you are making a difference? And so for us, that's very important to make sure that they own the work and not just listen to what we're talking about. And then, as I noted earlier, about outcomes being reasonable, realistic, and achievable. Sometimes folks feel that they have to say big numbers in order to receive a grant. And that's not the way that we operate. We're all about how do you put down what you think you can actually achieve. And a lot of times when we're working, particularly with communities, this is a photo of us having community planning meetings in a rural city in the Mississippi Delta. And that's because we try to have the community engaged. And so we want to hear what they think that they can do, what they think is reasonable and realistic. But we also have basically we don't do the facilitating because we don't want anyone saying the foundation told us, but we hire folks to facilitate the conversations so that the members of those communities, can be a little clearer about what they want, and someone is guiding them to set realistic expectations on it. And so what you're looking at there is just a picture of a community that we were in, where we had residents participating at various tables and talking about what it is that they are trying to accomplish. And so the big thing is, what is your vision for your community? And then how do we help you achieve it? Next slide. And some of the key things that, as I said, we look for is the assessment of the capacity to accomplish this work. I talked about the people, but it's also important that folks have knowledge and experience. And what is in the things we ask them is what is collectively known about the issue. We want to ask them or challenge them on who are the individuals and or institutions with experience and passion about this work. And do we know where to get additional information, or do we need help finding or creating it? And that's important for us because we are located in Jackson and we're working across 3 states. And so it's essential that we not go in and do it for them, but how do we ask them the questions and work with them to say who can be your partners locally, to ensure that if we supply grants to you, you're able to be effective in it. And so we also go through what are the financials, intellectual as well as financial. And that's important because we want people to dream big, but we also don't want to set them up with those big dreams if financially it's not there, or it may be other factors that may interfere with being able to successfully do it. So we do try to look at assets, both intellectual and financial, and who else can be partners. And then we talk about what most people talk about, where are the opportunities and gaps. And then we look at who can be the partners there and what roles will they play within this process. Next slide. And the big thing for us, and what we talk a lot about to our grantees, is effective stewardship. And one, obviously, it's about effectively managing the money. But the other piece of it is what I've referenced before. You got to be very clear about your goals and objectives and the ability to deliver. Sometimes when people come in to talk to us, they assume they must throw out big numbers. Oh, we want to help 5,000 people. Well, if you're a town of 5,000, you can't help 5,000 in that process. And so we are always on them about, let's take that down and let's talk about what's achievable in your community. What are the resources there? Who can you bring into the fold? But let's not set high numbers, assuming that the higher the number means that we will get this grant. And then the other thing we're about is what I constantly keep saying is ensuring that there's capacity to effectively carry out the work. Sometimes folks have great ideas, and when we sit with them and say, now who local can do this? Sometimes they know folks, and sometimes it's a struggle, but it's a dream that this group want to make sure happen. But our role is, how do we make sure that you can be effective in this? And so sometimes it's like, let's narrow the scope of the work, or let's do part 1. We show success there, then we can do part 2. So I would sit and say our grant making is just not about giving an award and going away. Our grant making and the way that we work is about being a partner at the table throughout the entire process. Next slide. And the thing that we're always on them about is the stewardship. In particular, pay attention and stay in touch with both us, and it's also important for us to pay attention and stay in touch with them. And so it's a two-way call. We do make personal calls, but we also make site visits. For our belief here is we have to get out of the office and go and observe the work to really better understand it. So we don't just read reports or read information that they send, but we do cover the terrain in being able to do that. And from time to time, we may invite some of our donors along to observe the work that they're investing in. And it's important for us to, as I said before, provide updates up and down the ladder. We get resources to do it, so we want to keep those donors aware of what's happening. We also want to keep our board aware of what is happening. And so we are always striving for long-term partnerships in order to ensure that this work, in particular in these rural communities where resources are limited, but also sometimes for some folks, travel to those areas are a bit of a challenge. And so we make intentional purposes to be able to stay in touch with those grantees. And as I said, we do those site visits and we provide updates. But most importantly for us, we're about trying to build long-term partnerships. And again, we don't believe in prescribing a grant. It's more of our position. How can we be a partner to be sometimes the first phase, sometimes the second phase, but how do we look at ways to keep this work going even beyond us in this work? And that's a brief way that we work at the Foundation for the Mid-South. Next slide, it's just question and answers whenever that's available.
Thank you so much for that, Ivy. We really appreciate those insights. And I'll just serve a bit of testimony to the work of the Foundation for the Mid-South and investing in capacity. My very first project as getting into this work in Mississippi was with support through the Foundation for the Mid-South. So I really appreciate the work that you all do. We're going to see if Holly's able to join us. I know she's had technical difficulties. We'll give it another chance. Holly, are you able to?
Hi, can you hear me?
Right. Yes, we can. Yes, take it away.
All right. Oh, good. I've been sweating over here. So my apologies. I am having some technical difficulties today. My internet apparently went out at 5 till the hour. And so I'm on my phone. I can't actually see the presentation, but I've been listening along. And so I hopefully will be able to coordinate with my slides as we go along. But if something seems off between my words and the slides, please let me know. Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm Holly Frindell, Chief Program Officer with NALCAB, which is the National Association for Latino Community Asset Building. For those who are not familiar with us, we're a national membership organization with over 200 members working to build assets primarily in Latino and immigrant communities in 46 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. And today, I'm going to talk about our role as one of the pillars that Tony talked about, the technical assistance providers. That is a piece of the work that we do. We support our members with what we call 4 C's. One is capital, which we do through grant making and lending. 2 is capacity building, which we do through training and technical assistance. Collective voice, we do some policy advocacy for policies and funding that support economic development. And then comunidad, so leveraging the knowledge and experience and strength of our network. So if you move to slide 2, which is the one with the map on it, just a little bit about NALCAB's rural work. NALCAB actually started as a rural serving organization. Basically, executive directors and CEOs from primarily orgs that served the US-Mexico border felt that they weren't being equitably served by some of the traditional intermediaries, corporate and philanthropic funders. And so they came together to form an organization to help ensure that capital was truly flowing to Latino and immigrant communities that were often overlooked. About 35 to 40% of our work does touch rural communities. And one of the big ways that we do that is that we are a provider through the HUD Rural Capacity Building Program, or RCB, which enhances the capacity and ability of local governments, Indian tribes, and nonprofits like housing development organizations, CDCs, CHODOs, carry out community development and affordable housing activities, in particular that benefit low and moderate income families in rural areas. So we've been an RCB technical assistance provider since 2013. And in that time, we've engaged in about 136 TA assignments with 118 recipients. which has produced outcomes in the areas of community development, housing, training and education, and direct financial assistance. And that includes, we've assisted about 14 groups in accessing over 25 million in federal funding. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later because that's a really important part of our strategy. And this map just shows some of our, the current projects that we're engaged in. And most of our capacity building assistance is focused primarily on housing or small business economic development, although we do some other, a broad range of other projects, including sort of arts and economic development, and thinking about the capacity to build household financial capability. So if you move to the next slide, in our work with rural governments and nonprofits, we've seen a really wide range in need. A lot of that does come back to what Tony mentioned, which is just having enough people to do this work. And so we think of our work as a supplement, a plug-in. As Ivy was saying, you know, it's not that we come in, do the work ourselves, give a, you know, this is how it must be done, but it's that we're working with either the municipalities or the nonprofits and looking at their needs. And what we find is that they loosely fall into about 5 categories: planning, training or staff capacity, resource development or access to capital, community engagement, and obtaining kind of certification that kind of helps open up doors. Really, this relates back to resource development and access to capital, having the right, you know, the right qualifications and certifications in place to be able to access some of those funding. If you move to the next slide, which should have the planning, training, and resource development, I actually don't have these slides in front of me, so I'm not going to read through all of the different TA activities that we do, but just kind of mention some that we primarily focus on. So planning, we do a lot of strategic planning, making community plans, bringing groups together to create those community plans. Training and staff capacity is one that we do a lot of work around, particularly around board training, particularly around organizations that are wanting to start lending, increasing access to capital in rural areas. And then resource development and access to capital, I mentioned that was a really important part of our strategy. NowCab ourselves, we are a CDFI, and we do have a rural loan fund where we do make loans to rural organizations at 0% interest to support affordable housing and small business lending. And then, as I mentioned, we've had a lot of success, that have really helped catalyze rural organizations in accessing federal funding, particularly the CED program under the U.S. Health and Human Services program. That can provide up to $800,000 for projects that create jobs in rural communities or in any communities. We've had success helping rural organizations apply. And that can be really catalytic for organizations. In a minute, I'm going to share a case study of an organization where that was very catalytic for them. And then on the next slide, just some examples of ways in which we engage in TA around community engagement and certification. Community engagement is really around community planning processes, and certification is, as I mentioned, obtaining that designation that's going to allow them to access funds, particularly federal funds. And a really important one here is CDFI certification. So for organizations that are lending in rural communities, pursuing the CDFI Technical Assistance Awards, which is a monetary award that helps them pursue certification, as well as once they're certified, applying for the CDFI Financial Assistance Awards, which provides lending capital, has been really, really important. So if you move to the next slide, as I may have mentioned, I think one of the best ways to illustrate how this capacity building work and its impact is to talk about a few specific examples. So one example I want to highlight is our work with El Pájaro CDC in Watsonville, California. So El Pájaro has been serving this community for around 40 years. They support rural small businesses, and their services and both the services they offer and the number of people they have served has really increased, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years. They started out with a business development course, and what they found is that many of the businesses that they were working with were food-based. They did not have access to a commercial kitchen in their rural area. So they identified that as a need, and they undertook a capital campaign and built a commercial kitchen. And then what they identified is their entrepreneurs might start out in their commercial kitchen, but they needed access to capital. They needed access to small business loans to be able to progress from, there's an example of a nopales producer and vendor who, as they were able to access space in the commercial kitchen, then were able to get contracts to begin selling in local grocery stores. And at each step of the way needed some working capital to be able to design labels, get their packaging system down, et cetera, et cetera. So they've increased their services along with the needs that they're seeing in their rural area. NALCAB has really supported this growth through building their capacity to lend in particular. We connected them with a peer who had a small business model based on lending circles, which was very relevant to the population that they were serving. We helped them set up their structure to lend. We did training for their staff and board and their lending committee, helped them get set up with a lending committee. NALCAB as a CDFI was able to provide them with a $2,000 loan from our rural loan fund, which seeded their lending capital. And then we helped them apply for multiple CED awards. And in 2020, they were awarded an $800K loan, again, to seed their lending capital, which was to establish the revolving loan fund, in particular to finance 5 expanding small businesses and agricultural entrepreneurs. And then this kind of started to have a snowball effect. In 2019, we helped them apply for the CDFI TA award, which they were awarded in 2020. And we also helped them apply for the Women's Business Center, for a Women's Business Center award, which they also were awarded in 2020. So this really has kind of shepherded an era, kind of catalytic growth for this organization. And so that's kind of an example of how we see this growth, how TA really plays a role in expanding capacity in rural areas. I have a second example, but I think I may be out of time. Is that the case, timekeepers, or do you want me to go ahead and share that second example, or do you want to move on to Q&A? Either one is fine.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think we will move on to Q&A, Holly.
Okay, great.
All right, well, thank you so much. Thanks to all of our panelists, and we really appreciate working across technical difficulties. I'll just say, first of all, I've learned so much. The Regional Rural Development Centers, we received part of our support through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, NIFA, to do capacity building. And I feel like I've been in a capacity building class, really learning from leaders and experts at different levels.
Thank you, Don. We want to let you know that immediately following this webinar, you'll be sent a follow-up survey, and I promise you it will take less than a minute. Before we wrap up, I'd like to encourage those of you who enjoyed our webinar to sign up for our newsletter as well. We also have a podcast series, Get a Grip on FAIR, available on our website, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or by visiting rss.com/podcast/keeping up with FAIR. You can also find that on our website. You can also find it by searching our name. That's the Council on Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics on any of the platforms. And last but not least, please follow us on Twitter for regular updates at CFAIRCon. That is at CFARECON. We also encourage any and all inquiries at information@cfare.com. A quick word of thanks to our partners. This and all of our Seafair programming wouldn't be possible without the continuing support of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, AAEA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Agricultural Statistics Service, that's NASS, as well as USDA's Economic Research Service, that's ERS. We want to give you a big thank you to all of our panelists. And lastly, I'd like to thank the audience. We're passionate about this subject, and we think you are too, but it's no small thing to plan to give up an hour of your time to spend with us, even if it is lunchtime. We hope you've enjoyed this event as much as we've enjoyed hosting it. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.